So everybody, I think, knows Professor Peter Kawalek, background in computer science, director of the Centre for Information Management at Loughborough, because it says so on that slide in front of me. And I'm one of my best friends for the last 30 years. I'm not entirely sure how he puts up with me, but he always has. So Peter is going to talk about process and organisation, and beyond that, I know nothing, so I shall shut up. Be grateful if others would mute their microphones.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just to check the sound and all that stuff. I think it's probably working. Thank you, John. So process or process, that's the first question, but let's go with process on this occasion, though I might vary as we go through. So just to introduce the topic, and first of all, thank you for your time. Absolute pleasure. And great society, etc., and always great discussion. So thank you for your time. And then to talk about this topic of process and organization, and what am I on about here is, well, the aim is to explore kind of process philosophy across three writers, and the three writers who wrote separately and in different areas. And in the first of those writers is Alfred North Whitehead, and in his terms, this is a kind of a journey from scientific materialism to ecological relations. And to kind of add another bookend to it, it's in Donna Haraway's language. This is about it mattering. Things matter. It matters what worlds. A point we'll come back to later, but it's just how we think about the world ultimately has an influence on how that world becomes manifest. Now, I put at the end also that this is a festive essay because it's Christmas, or nearly Christmas, and it's my kind of get out of jail card, because some of this stuff you might know better than me. And I'm just learning. I put on the first slide also that this is take one on this topic, and take two, if I have a go again, might have to be 2 years hence, because there's a lot of complexity here, but also some very interesting material. Anyway, in the spirit, you know, please feel free to interrupt, to contribute, to correct, etc. We will see where we get to, but in the spirit of a kind of discussion, and we will see what happens. So three writers, and we're looking at their process philosophy, and we're kind of building connections and exploring links between them. And first up is Alfred North Whitehead, born in 1861, died in 1947, a child of grandparents and parents, father and grandfather who were Anglican schoolmasters. He attended Trinity College, Cambridge, to study mathematics, where he became part of what I think is a kind of self-declared group called the Apostles, who studied philosophy together, and he became later doctoral supervisor to Bertrand Russell. Influenced, but also in some ways arguably slightly ahead of the work on general relativity and quantum mechanics that was emerging during his lifetime. And when he got into his 60s, his real career began. So we heard about John talked about age earlier, but Alfred North Whitehead didn't teach philosophy till he was in his 60s, and then he taught it at Harvard. And it's sometimes said that the first philosophy lecture he ever heard was one that he gave. So he came into that from mathematics fairly late in life, and made his biggest contribution there. In terms of his thinking, many sources, many influences, but perhaps to highlight Plato, but also, and perhaps a little bit more distinguishing of him, William Wordsworth. And I think those who know the Romantic poets will detect some of the thinking in how he lays out a kind of process philosophy. And I think some of you will possibly detect some of that sort of Wordsworth, and that kind of a great reaction of the Romantic poets, whereby they were kind of trying to articulate a sensoriness, a passion, and a connectedness of us as individuals and our relation with the world. So Plato and Wordsworth as influences that I would highlight for him. So to start, to explore the process philosophy of A.N. Whitehead, where to start? The best place to start with Heraclitus and the kind of famous observation, famous saying, which is to say that you cannot step into the same river twice. The river will always have changed. Yet also important to see in Heraclitus's observation, so too will the swimmer, or that person who steps into the river, that person will also have changed, kind of molecular changes, experiential changes. So you cannot step into the same river twice, because the river will always have changed, and so too will the swimmer, or the would-be swimmer, will always have also changed. And so this is quite a neat and nice starting point to look at what Whitehead is saying. He's basically saying that change is the ultimate, process is the ultimate, and he builds up an event ontology to say that in a way, the way in which we can approach our understanding of the world is to see change, a kind of constant series of events, as ultimate. This is what is as close as we can get to calling anything a foundation. It is change itself. It is events. They are events themselves, rather than say matter, because matter is just a series of events ultimately. So during his lifetime, quantum theory also was kind of ruling out the idea of a substantial particle. And Whitehead was elaborating what he called this kind of process relational ontology, which is basically to say that it's all process and it's all relations. You know, it's all relations between different processes, between different experiences, because any identity is constructed out of something's relations rather than the properties of it itself. So, for example, in regard to each of us here, the 10 of us assembled here, it is our participation in a kind of nexus of relationships at many levels that distinguishes us. So we are all process, we are all a kind of unfolding series of events, and what distinguishes us is our participation in some nexus of relationships which is different to our neighbor. Related then to the kind of observation of Heraclitus in the river is Whitehead's observation, where he says, "No thinker thinks twice." No thinker thinks twice. By the time you have that next thought, the prior thought has changed you. You are always in this kind of dynamic role. You are always moving forward in this kind of series of events, and you are kind of in this kind of constant state of unfolding, constant state of becoming. No thinker thinks twice. By the time the second thought arrives, you have changed. So it's a different thinker in some way. Now, to try and illustrate this, a couple of points. I think this is not the strongest one, but helps me to make certain observations about what he's saying. But so to take the example of fire and skin. So fire heats the air and causes bodily reactions. This will help us position some of the work as we go forward. Fire heats the air and causes bodily reactions. And there's a kind of a causality within the system. The fire, the intervening space, the skin, the nerve endings, the neurons, etc. And what Whitehead is saying is that these are all within the system. Try not to think about the fire impacting upon the separate observer. See everything as within the system, and then mind how you, in a sense, construct your understanding of the system within that. The point that I'm trying to get to here is that the relations are within the system. the fire and the skin are within the system, and the boundaries of what you are defining as separate, maybe a person and the fire, are fluid. And he's trying to make an argument that the kind of Cartesian dualism is a kind of violation. It's too set. Mind as an observer, and then that which is observed is too fixed. It's too firm. It's a kind of violation, he calls it. What we should see is, in a sense, many potential descriptions of systems within a greater system. And come back to that point in a moment, but maybe a slightly lighter way of describing it is the idea of the arrival of the cook into the dining room. And this kind of statement he makes that the ingression of the cook into the dining room causes the arrival of dinner. And this is a kind of misplaced idea of causal relations. Again, he's just trying to make people think about boundaries here. So he's not just making the kind of obvious point about the correlation and causality. He's saying that this kind of idea of the ingression of the cook into the dining room causes the arrival of dinner is a huge simplification. And what we actually have is an opportunity to describe and redescribe systems at different scope. That's the point he wants to make. That I believe so. That we have the chance to describe systems at different scope and describe and redescribe in order to build knowledge about, say, the production of dinner. And so, for example, we could go to the kitchen and we could see that it's not just the ingression of the cook into the dining room that causes the arrival of dinner, but there's a whole production suite in the scullery, in the kitchen. And before that, there's a whole agricultural suite of activity and supply chain into it. And beyond the agricultural supply chain, there's the kind of biological processes. And within the biological processes are the kind of atomic processes of the production of carrots, for example, or whatever. So he's saying the danger of, the danger of such a construction is a simplistic causality. And I would argue that actually that quite a lot of the teaching that we do in business schools suffers from this. And sometimes our pursuit of rigor, we say from our survey, our management survey, or so on and so forth, with just a little bit of mechanistic understanding, we make claims in the management literature that the arrival of the cook into the dining room causes the arrival of dinner. Not true. A far more fluid system sits underneath this. So this is what Whitehead is beginning to invite us into thinking, that there are kind of fluid boundaries here, and to demarcate our system is very much part of how we understand things. There are points about creativity which I'm going to pass very quickly, but creativity becomes important in his understanding of the world because there are kind of situations of non-alignment whereby innovation can happen because things play. Because things play, new discovery is possible within systems. That's a point I'll come back to later if we need to. But creativity is another thing that becomes important in Whitehead's process philosophy. But better for me to focus on this point, which is the idea of a society. Whitehead is famously difficult. One reason why I'm still grappling with him. My first discovery of his work was in the 1990s when I was doing my PhD, and I was studying software architectures, to be honest. And from software architectures, I managed to arrive at Stafford Beer, and Stafford Beer's work took off in our software engineering group in Manchester, and that really took off. And then after that, the next hurdle seemed to be to go and understand the process philosophy, process and reality of Alfred North Whitehead. And I've told John the story, but when I went in 1996 studying for my PhD to take the book, Whitehead's book, out of the Manchester John Rylands library, I took it. I remember it well. It's a red hardback, very plain red hardback. And inside it, I discovered that I was the first person to take that book out since 1968. And I remember thinking to myself, well, the Beatles were still a thing, and that seemed ages ago, you know, that kind of thing. You know, I don't think Let It Be had been released at that point. And I was the first person to take this book out. Whitehead is famously difficult and very much went out of fashion, and has had a sort of a partial return, in some ways quite a substantial return, because of how people are seeking to understand the third part of my talk today, which will be kind of on ecological relations. But part of what makes him difficult is the way in which he uses language. But there is a sense to it. And so he takes the idea of a society and he generalizes that term, and he generalizes it downwards to atoms, or among groups of animals, or to stars, or anything that groups together forms a society. That's his argument. Anything that groups together is a society. And then societies manifest identity through a process which he calls concrescence. And so things that group together are societies at whatever level, and their identity is through a process which he calls concrescence. And this is really the heart of it. So this is core to Whitehead's philosophy, and he's basically saying that concrescence occurs at all levels from physics to psychology to sociology. Wherever you want to see societies, you can see concrescence. And this is the moment-to-moment creation of identity. 3 slides on this, but this is the heart of it. The moment-to-moment creation of identity. Okay, we might want to define moment and what's meant by rates there, but for the time being, just observe this is process, this is flow, this is identity as flow. Concrescence is identity as flow, a moment-to-moment creation of identity. All of us sitting here now are exhibiting all of us in Whitehead's terms are exhibiting concrescence. We are flowing, we are moving, our chemistry is changing, we are going through renewal, we are going through concrescence. All of us are in some state of flow, all of us here. None of us is fixed material, all of us are flowing. And he's arguing that kind of occasions of experience inherit from one another, something I'll come back to on the next slide. And he makes points about consciousness arising from complexity. So he, to try and understand it as best I can, I'm saying that what he sees is societies are formed and societies are experiential. And some of that experience might be, say, in our bodily terms, just sensory. You know, I detect the presence of the desk against my leg here, but it's not really my conscious activity unless I turn to it. But there is a sensory experience going on there. But consciousness comes when we add complexity. So consciousness is made up of processes, the same processes as we see at a lower order, but just more of them. So in a sense, we have a kind of a multiple process organism. And as we sufficiently cram in, my terminology now, my ugly terminology, as we sufficiently cram in processes into a kind of a grouping, into a network, then consciousness emerges. But it's not unique in process terms. It's utilizing processes that we see elsewhere in the kind of the cascading array of societies. So consciousness emerges with complexity. As things become more complex, they become more conscious. And within this is an intrinsic teleology. It's coming from within. There is a teleological element, very strong teleological element to Whitehead's work, but it's not imposed from without. It's situated from within. Those of you who are beginning to reach for purpose of a system is what it does, very much the right sort of territory. He's saying it is there is within the system, within the cosmos, within the universe, a kind of teleology in the design of the thing. And that, he argues, is aiming towards a kind of generation of complexity and the harmonization of that complexity. He uses the word beauty. So the system is trying to generate diversity and to harmonize amongst that diversity. And that's, in a sense, what life is. Carrying on with concrescence, again, the argument is that it's the heart of it. Occasions of experience, what I said on the previous slide, occasions of experience inherit from one another. So we as subject are, in a sense, created out of a superject, which is ourselves. So our prior subjective self is the superject to our momentary current self. Need to qualify that a little bit. But in a sense, we are in this process of flow, and he distinguishes between subject, as I am created in a new moment. Let's call it a new day if we want to keep it simply. As I am created in a new moment, then my prior self is the superject that has created me. And then I'm the subject. And then I become the superject to the next me. This is what he's meaning by concrescence. Our prior subjective self is the superject to a momentary current self that then dies and becomes the superject to our next momentary current self. Again, maybe we just think about this day by day to keep it simple. Each day, yesterday was the superject to our today, and our today will become superject to our tomorrow. But each one will die, and there'll be a kind of constant arising and perishing. And then an important point, that we take our experiences, our relationships, which have defined us. So the relationship that I had with friends and colleagues, family, etc., on one day or through one moment, forms the me, the new me that's created as the subject. So we take our relationships with us in this arising and perishing. Everything is process, everything is flow, everything is being created. Everything is in this process of creation, which is also creative. So according to this thinking, without others I am nothing, because in a sense my manifest self is a kind of record of all the relationships, of all the experience I've had through kind of influx of the other. So without others, there would be no me to manifest. You know, this is the point, is that this is a relational process of relations. What creates identity are the relations being fed into, the experiences being fed into to me. And by others, I mean people, absolutely, but I also mean experiences. You know, anything that can affect any kind of society which is associated with me. So each moment of experience is constituted by the influx of the other. And my experience, me, is the bringing together of the perished experience of the beings in my environment. So the friends that I met with moments ago or days ago, their perished selves become part of my experience, and therefore Whitehead is arguing we are quite literally made of each other. This is what he calls organic realism, and this is where we begin to move from Whitehead into Beer and into Haraway and into the kind of understanding of ecological relations that we has become so important today. So he calls this organic realism. And again, he generalizes the term organism to atoms as well as plants, animals, to self-organizing systems, you know, to this miracle of self-organizing systems. And he makes the argument that the universe is an evolving ecology of organisms. And reality is the experience of these organisms. And value is intrinsic and derived from the harmonization of these organisms. What the teleology is trying to do is to generate variety and to harmonize it. Again, you can kind of see variety attenuation, variety amplification straight away in the kind of concepts that Whitehead is giving us, anticipating Beer as the next author. And some kind of maybe important, maybe side argument that our kind of modern and deluded overvaluing of efficiency, etc., is a result of our not understanding ourselves as a kind of ongoing flow and part of an environment, but as a kind of Cartesian separation from that environment. As we make misjudgments about the nature of our relationship because we start from a kind of a material position instead of a position of process. So, and one of the manifestations of that is that we have a deluded overvaluing of efficiency as a way of operating in the world, rather than seeking the harmonization of the world, being part of that kind of pursuit of harmonization. Right, still with me. Blank slide. Next to Stafford Beer. I discovered Beer before I discovered Whitehead, and in a way, Beer led me to Whitehead. I've got to be honest, back in the 90s when I first studied Whitehead, I did reference him in my PhD, but it never took off with me and was struggling basically. And so the reference I make to Whitehead back in the 1990s was more or less me trying to show off to the examiner and to suggest that I might know more than I really did. If I'd have been asked some tough questions, I think I might be sitting here, but not with the doctor title. I got away with it on that occasion, but process philosophy as process and organization is our concern, and from Whitehead and his positioning events and flow as the very center of life, as the very center of our knowing of the world, we come to Stafford Beer, whose journey I think in some ways started with well, you could say the military, but also with Sheffield steel mills, and then began to move outwards, obviously the huge engagement in Chile, but ultimately comes to poetry, for example, and him talking about the ultra stability of systems and using reference models from nature for descriptions of the world. So he kind of comes in maybe through Sheffield steel and flow of materials, but ultimately I think we know him today as a writer of much more than that, a much greater grandeur than that, and again a kind of process philosophy. So once we've kind of taken in Whitehead and we said, well, everything is flow, then quite an interesting question is, so what coheres? What forms a society? Or what forms one of those self-organizing systems that Whitehead talks about? And how do we understand any of the pattern creation that we see in nature? And I think this is where I can put in Beer very comfortably indeed. Beer gives us ways of addressing and answering that question of what coheres. What coheres? Why do patterns form? And what are the patterns that we might expect to form and then survive in all of that flux, in all of that flow of Whitehead? How do we form the societies? How do we form the self-organizing systems? How do the organisms, in a sense, build patterns and relations? This is where I think the Beerian cybernetics can be positioned as a very comfortable fit in terms of providing answers. So through Beer, we can begin to address the idea of self-organizing systems, and we can make observations about societies and relationships, and that's all we know from a Whiteheadian world. And then Beer's idea of a science of effective organization, I think, sits with a little bit more grandeur than I'd seen before. I think only really recently have I really begun to understand how inspired that definition of cybernetics is, because in a sense, I think he is saying what coheres, what can cohere, what relations can be sustained through a process of flow. And we can understand this with our kind of control and communication emphasis, feedback loops, viability, taking cybernetics now as a kind of study of harmonizations. You know, harmonization is what the universe is aiming towards, according to Whitehead, and understanding when these harmonizations can happen, something much greater than, say, profit and efficiency, again, just to cite Beer directly, is where we come to with kind of utilizing cybernetics. So cybernetics is a kind of study of harmonizations. Ideas of viability become very important here, always were very important, but they become very important here because what makes an organism viable, again, in this kind of process flow, what makes an organism viable, Ashby's ideas of requisite variety is a kind of way of seeing into this space. And then I would draw a parallel between the Cybernetics idea of the steersman and the superject. And the purpose of a system is what it does. And the superject, which is driving the flow into its next form, is in a sense, I think, a very interesting parallel with the idea of the steersman from cybernetics, from Cybernetics itself. And on the ideas that we saw in Whitehead, we are seeing here too, ideas of intrinsic control, of ultra stability. And the purpose of a system is what it does. Autopoiesis, that kind of closed set of relations, and as Donna Haraway elaborates it, sympoiesis, which is multiple autopoietic relations sat alongside each other and occasionally interacting by accident or design, by creativity or by accident. So all of this kind of generating flow, taking shape, taking patterns, and forming something, forming the world we know out of it as a kind of an, again, Whitehead started on the journey from scientific materialism and ended up with a kind of school of ecological relations, or at least the foundation of that school. And Beer, to my argument, sits very comfortably within that, as in the way in which he elaborates what coheres. So autopoietic relations, sympoietic relations, again, this is now adding to the Whitehead. Now we are beginning to say, yes, I can see how some of these organisms are created and how they cohere. And that kind of light-hearted problem, I think light-hearted for Whitehead, well, it's a rare thing, but that light-hearted problem of the ingression of the cook into the dining room causing the arrival for dinner. I mean, again, you know, like I say that sometimes I think our research methods in business schools just basically say, if we get statistical significance between A and B, and we can plausibly describe a mechanism between the two, then we've got some science going on here. I think, according to Whitehead, according to Beer, it's not enough. It's not enough because there's so much description, so much contestation of any given boundary that we draw, that we should be kind of very consciously seeking for ways to describe those boundaries. How can we do that? Well, the notion of viability gives us a way of consciously drawing a boundary into a system such as the production of dinner. And we can draw that as a kind of VSM, as a viable system model. So the concept of viability and recursive modeling gives us a way of systematically, or systemically, I should say, exploring that production, whether it be from serving on the table, the kitchen unit, something like a Sheffield steel mill, the production of materials into that kitchen unit, or the agriculture and biology that goes on before that. We look for viable systems in some nested recursion. Again, Beer is now conducting us through the space that Whitehead says is so problematic. So the identification of the system in focus and the implication of systemic action beyond gives us a scientific mode of exploration of all the variables in the system. And the rules of viability are therefore telling us about coherence. You know, they're telling us about organization that is effective in the real world. So just to kind of say that I think beer is allowing us to explore any given problem space and to make sense of it, and to make conscious decisions about the boundary setting, which is so problematic. So for example, to take another example, the arrival of the criminal on the streets causes the theft of the bag. Well, that's about as far as some politicians get with their crime policy, policing policy, for example. But again, you know, you can take beer and you can say, well, actually, an alternative systemic exploration would be to ask how criminality becomes viable. And then using and co-opting some of the language of Whitehead, what is the society of criminality? What is the system in focus, and how do we explore relations within that space? What ecology is being expressed here? And again, what I'm trying to do is trying to go from the philosophy of Whitehead to see a nice situation, a kind of complementary situation of beer's positioning, but also begin to approach practical outcomes, that we can begin to sort of use beer to generate practical outcomes that we cannot do with Whitehead alone, I don't think. So again, we elaborate the system boundary. We say, well, there's got to be more to it than the arrival of the criminal on the streets causes the theft of the bag. Let's have a look. Let's have a look through that concept of viability, and let's begin to identify what's the system in focus here, and how does the kind of society of criminality work. Or something like the arrival of the storm on the runway causes congestion in the terminal. Well, does it? Does it? I mean, isn't this just maybe two flow systems, one the weather and the other the arrival of passengers into the terminal? And can we describe this in another way and elaborate it in another way, in which we can be conscious of our boundary setting, and then we can you know, be conscious of the ecology that we're trying to express, and come towards practical outcomes. Right, so what I think I've done so far is to try and situate the idea of process philosophy, and this idea that everything can be understood as flow, that it has a lineage associated with some of the most important scientific discoveries, and that in some ways it seems to illuminate and add to Beer's work on cybernetics. And I think cybernetics, as the kind of study of those flow processes, it becomes central and important as how we can turn this into kind of meaningful observations. But there's more. And at the risk of overcooking a short presentation like this, I wanted to ultimately connect to the idea of ecological relations, which I introduced at the start by talking about Donna Haraway's exhortation that that it matters what you think. It matters what worlds, and it matters if we think of ourselves as separate from our environment, or if we see ourselves as manifest within and in a constant state of flow as part of an environment, and as, in a sense, as a manifestations of the relations that we have encountered within that environment, from biological to the societal. So on this topic of process and organization, I arrive finally at Donna Haraway and how she situates ideas of ecological relations. She does cite both Whitehead and not Beer actually, but cybernetics in her work. So she is some ways consciously drawing on this background theory to try and describe the kind of ecological crisis that we're in, where it came from, and how a kind of rethinking might have powerful and positive generative effects. Quite a nice place to start is with this kind of, I'm slightly misquoting Alan Watts. But Alan Watts, the kind of, some of you will know, but kind of Buddhist philosopher, he argues that, you know, a kind of problem of the modern Western mind is that of looking at an alien landscape from within a bag of skin. I'm kind of paraphrasing him here, but you see what he's saying. He's saying that, you know, the relation of the world to me is one of resources only. What can it provide to me? He's saying that's the danger of a disembeddedness from the environment, seeing myself as material, and a material self that needs to operate in an environment and needs to succeed in that environment by, in a sense, conquest of its resources on my behalf. That is what Watts is trying to critique here. And that's kind of, if we see ourselves as separate, he's arguing, and Whitehead is arguing much earlier than Watts, etc. Whitehead is arguing that the danger is that we see a world of resources to kind of satisfy our alien minds. Our alien minds now are separate to the world and observing it, and deciding what we need and what we might desire, that field for our produce, for example. And this is where Haraway critiques very powerfully the idea of resources as a way of seeing the world. If we are seeing the world as a set of resources, then in a sense we are saying we are beyond the world, we are separate to it. It's kind of her critique. And if, you know, like she draws, this is a picture that she utilizes, but at some points in history, everything in this picture would have been seen as a resource. Everything in this picture would have been seen as a resource, as shocking as that might be. And today, everything in this picture is, in a sense, a resource. You know, we've flattened that landscape. We've taken out of it its variety. We've subdued its harmonization, and we've made it do one thing. We've cut across the teleology described by Whitehead, and we've made it do one thing. And then more natural landscape you see beyond on the hillsides, but this landscape is not natural. This landscape is not natural. This is the resource mentality looking at the world. Now, we can critique and debate for many reasons, but this is the alien seeing the world of resources and co-opting it into his production of self, production of separate self. This is the argument of a kind of ecological relations process view of the world. So if I go back to organic realism, which is Whitehead's ultimate position, if he says, he's saying basically, we are not separate to, we are not alien possessors of a planet, we are flow, we are actually an expression of relations of the world. And if instead we conduct our address to the world through organic realism, wherein we understand the universe, the whole of it, much beyond us, but in containing us, and so on, as a kind of evolving ecology of organisms, and in which reality is the experience of these organisms, and wherein then value is intrinsic and derived from the harmonization of those organisms, then we kind of move towards a new perspective, a new understanding of the world. And this is what Haraway makes such a big play of in her work. She basically conjures this idea of the Thulacene, which is a kind of a great prospective world of tentacular relations where we are seeing things as entangled with one another, very much the position that Whitehead also takes. So in the world of Donna Haraway now, great ecological writer, she's welcoming us forward and ushering us forward into a kind of Thulacene, be with the entangled world and see it in a new way, pursue a future of tentacular relations. And this is a world of great variety. Again, I'm using that Beerian Ashby term deliberately. and it's a world of becoming with. We become with exactly what Whitehead was trying to express. We become with the harmonizations, with the relations of the world that we bring together. And one powerful expression of this is her notion. It's not actually her notion, but I can't remember the source. She certainly makes a big play of it, of sympoiesis, which is in a sense lots of organisms in autopoietic relations, and then in a sense what the whole of all of those autopoietic relations becomes is this sympoietic ecology, the super ecology of sympoiesis. And the autopoietic relations have interfaces to each other, sometimes accidental, sometimes creative. So new spontaneity can arise from within systems. Haraway's call is very simple in the end. After all of this philosophy, it's very simple. She's basically saying, see the world in a different way and stay with the trouble of it. See the world in a different way and stay with the trouble of it. Make it work. Find ways to work. It's not easy. There is no simple solution. We need food and we need sustenance and all of those things. But let's begin to pivot our understanding and see the world in a different way and stay with the trouble of that. Nobody says it's going to be intellectually easy. Nobody says there's a formula. There is just a knot of new issues for us, another tentacularity for us moving forwards, but where we understand ourselves as part of process, and part of process embedded in the relations of the world. So 2 slides to go. And so Whitehead's kind of organic realism relates well to understanding ecological relations and that kind of world of understanding through Lovelock and others and so on and so forth that has emerged since. It also implies that it's not easy, because the prior relations that we have had, the societies at all levels, are superject to how we are now. So our new manifestation is not a clean cut, but at the societal level, at individual levels, we are all kind of subject to our superject prior selves and the kind of course of expectations and so on and so forth that we have been on. So to pivot and to change to a more process-based understanding of reality and take that through to a series of conclusions about ecological relations is a major challenge. And noting that many of our kind of schools of thinking or practices of intellectual rigor actually enforce boundaries that are too fixed, that are not sufficiently discussed in the average PhD thesis and are too fixed. And so we also underestimate the potential contribution of carefully defining what viable systems are. So boundaries in our understanding of the world should always be understood as negotiable, indefinite, informed by Stafford Beer's work, for example. And coming back to that point about creativity, non-alignment, because sometimes things go out of kilter and so on and so forth, is an opportunity for innovation. So again, putting it together, Whitehead is giving us a lot of philosophy here. Beer is allowing us to make sense of it and to explore the problem spaces. And Haraway is reminding us that it matters how we think about the world. In that nice phrase she has, it matters what worlds. It matters if we think of ourselves as in a state of organic realism. It matters if we think of ourselves as flow, because the world we then thus generate will be different to the one that we might generate thinking of ourselves as a kind of aliens in a bag of skin in Alan Watts's rather unkind description. It matters what worlds. This more elaborate understanding of Whitehead, of Beer, is leading us to a kind of more fruitful set of ecological relations, of understanding our contribution to the planet. It matters what worlds worlds. The aim is to explore process philosophy across three writers. That was my aim for today, who wrote in three different eras, and to find some kind of harmonizations among them. That's what I set out to do. No idea whether I've done that, but process and relations are key to this understanding of the world. And this is just take one. If I'm invited back for take two, may I suggest that it's about 2025, because Whitehead's work is hard. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Peter. I'm not entirely sure where to start, but I'm going to start with, if we go right back to the first slide. When I submitted my doctoral thesis, my supervisor said to me, paragraph 1, chapter 1 is brilliant, but chapter 1, so paragraph 2, chapter 1 needs to be very, very clear about what your PhD isn't all about. And then he said the rest of it was fine. I want to go right back to paragraph 2 of what you've just said, Peter, the privileges of holding the microphone, I guess. If you invert the original assumption that says, you know, I'm simplifying greatly, identity emerges from flow. How does that work if we invert it and say flow emerges from identity? So the society that you observe creating itself, because we observe the flow of the society, we can identify the thing as the flow rather than the other way around. And that sort of, and I thought, okay, I've got 73 other questions, but that's a sort of decent one to start with. Do you want to start unsharing? And I know Robin's got his hand up as well, but and I'm not even sure there's an answer to the question.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but I think it's a good challenge, that one, and it's a good way of exploring the kind of ontology that Whitehead sets out. But I suppose, I think he would probably be reasonably comfortable as long as we are seeing dynamic relations as primary. As the minute we say that something is material and fixed, that's when he would work his finger. So,
okay, because Stafford would have said, yeah, the purpose of the system is what it does, and we have to observe the system doing its stuff in order to identify what it is. So I know one of his books, I can't remember which one, talks about the railways as a machine for stopping him smoking, because he couldn't, stopping him working, because he couldn't work if he couldn't smoke, and he couldn't smoke on the train. Therefore, the purpose of the system as he experienced it, this is the lived experience question. You know, the purpose of the railway as he experienced it was to stop him working, which is sort of, you know, very frustrating.
Yeah.
So we observe it. So if we take the flow as the thing that's observable rather than the identity as the thing that's observable, then the system is everything. So my identity is effectively a statement of everything that isn't me. Yeah, I have to observe my identity by defining things that aren't me.
That's a kind of Hegelian position, which is quite interesting. I'm not, again, a little bit nervous of how that fits with Whitehead, but that, I think that's where Hegel would say that John Beckford's identity is formed part substantially through the antithesis to John Beckford. Yeah. Now, I think. Let me have a go at it. I think that a more Whiteheadian view would be to say that, a bit like your intro, etc., that the John Beckford we have in front of us is manifest out of, you mentioned your parents in Northern Ireland, you mentioned some friendships along the way, perhaps the family got to mention, etc., and so on and so forth. And say, I think a more Whiteheadian view would say the John Beckford we have before us is a manifestation of all those relations co-opted into the identity that we see in front of us today.
Well, I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. That's cool. Robin, you've been very patient again, still, forever.
Thank you. Two sentences I really picked up on. The first one, without others, I am nothing.
Yes.
And the second, it matters what you think.
Yes.
Separately, I've been working and contemplating on organizational culture. And one of the sort of understandings from that is that culture is the emergence of values and behaviors from interactions, in your words, relations between parties.
Yes, yes.
And in our little group discussing this, one of them said, can you have culture in a shed if you're on your own? Can an individual have culture? And if we take the interaction element, then no, you can't have culture as an individual, but you can be cultured through interactions. So culture from the noun is moved into culture to the verb, which makes a lot more sense to us. And the new word for me tonight is thylacine, if that's how I say it. Yep. So is thylacine the equivalent to culture, the optimization or optimal alignment, harmonization of values and behaviors between parties?
So I would say that the noun to verb thing, I think will sit extremely well with the underlying process philosophy. In fact, I think that quite often Whitehead is really quite boring because he's trying to elaborate terminology to get us around the kind of the noun structure of the English language, and to see verbs where we see we often position nouns. So I think on that, I think culture culture as a kind of outcome of a network of relations, I think as an ongoing outcome of a network of relations, I think would fit well. And I think that kind of emphasis on the verb, yes, I think that's a very good observation. Second to that, then, without others, I am nothing. This is a point that Whitehead is strong on. So in the sense that the kind of maybe the first maternal or care relation is in a sense the onset of the creation of identity from that point onwards. If you could ever dream of a circumstance where that didn't happen and nothing else happened, then you would have a being that is very different to the people that we see around us here. And then on the kind of the Thylacine as culture, I think that's a good prompt for probably quite a good PhD topic. But I think that would make a good PhD topic to explore that. But what Haraway is saying, that we should be expecting, in a sense, more complex, more entanglement, more tentacularities, pursuing more richness in our relations, rather than a more divisive toning down of relations. So a kind of a more colourful, more varied kind of culture is consistent with well-being of ourselves as individuals and of the planet.
So the more relations you have, the more cultured you become.
I think that's quite an interesting observation again, Robin. I think that's definitely worth exploring. I think that's anecdotally, I think we all like to meet somebody who's travelled well.
Is it cultured, or is it inured to the society in which you find yourself? Because they're not necessarily the same thing.
Good challenge. I suppose the interested traveller who has gone with empathetic relations through the world is always a good dinner party guest.
So I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball now. So
just for a change.
Just because it randomly appeared in my head and part of the flow, I thought I'd share it. Which is that if we accept the sort of the edicts of the physics brigade, the universe exists in a state of a process that is heading towards entropy, so a lower energetic, a less energetic, more organized, i.e. inert state. So if we are identity as flow, then we are descending into this state of complete inertia at some point. And so as human beings, when we intervene to create directedness in an organization, I'm thinking partly here of the work that Richard Berry is currently doing around the notion of sort of directed evolution. But I was in a coaching session with a well-known established church this morning, which has a sort of somewhat senior royal as its head, and we were looking at the governance structures of said institution, and what I realized in looking at them was that they are seeking to control and command what is, rather than to create or initiate what should be. Whether we agree with the should be or not, it doesn't kind of matter. The human intervention in the operation of the flow is the thing that takes it from before to now to then, which is, if we ignore clocks, we have a before, we have a now, we have a then in the future. So if it's all just flow, where does human directedness of a system come in?
I think this is where Stafford comes in as a way of cybernetics, as a way of understanding and then sensibly intervening in that flow. I think that's where cybernetics has its achievements, I think. So it's all just flow, but it does need to cohere, and human societies need to cohere. Probably our normal mistake is to undervalue diversity and to make things less resilient and less flexible. But with cybernetics, I think we can probably do the opposite. And make things more resilient and more varied, more consistent with the general thesis of process philosophy. So I think cybernetics is the way of intervening, as a kind of understanding and intervening, as a nice kind of catch-all statement. The physics bit is really hard, John. Before, I think that's really hard, but I did pick up from some of my reading in preparation for this that Whitehead is increasingly cited amongst physicists these days. That he went seriously out of fashion for a long period of time, but is increasingly cited as a source these days. And it's he wrote in 1920 of something that was that predated Feynman, around the idea of kind of quantum field effects, basically arguing that the electron is the field, not the electron has a field, but the electron is the field. He wrote about that in 1920, comfortably before Feynman, and he predated some of the observations of Heisenberg, also coming from a philosophical position as somebody who taught mathematics most of his life, by 6 or 7 years. So he has a rising stock in the area of physics as people recognize these contributions. But yeah, that's a really hard question. More than a curved ball, that's like a curving exocet.
I only write things down randomly as we're going through the talks, and I have no idea what the answers are to the questions that I seek to pose. But I guess it's my job to ask the questions, isn't it? There are lots of other people in the room being very quiet. Anybody want to come in? Nice to see you, Vanilla, by the way. Welcome. I was in talking of Liverpool, of beer. I was in Liverpool only last week, and I was delighted to discover that the beer collection, as a Stafford provided all of his materials to Liverpool, the beer collection is the most used collection at Liverpool John Laws University. Global inquiries all the time going through, which was really interesting. Because I was vaguely hoping it was unused so I could buy it for threepence and move it to Loughborough, but they want to hang on to it, so it's great.
Yeah.
John Oakland, you're looking very thoughtful. John and I had lunch last week and talked about the future of various things cybernetic and intelligent. And John's kindly turned up tonight to have a listen. What's your reflections, John?
This is the end of my spectrum of cybernetics, if you know what I mean. I live a lot of my life in the the real world of organizations and how to make improvements and get quality right when it's not right. So I can't really comment. I come from Sheffield, Peter, so I don't know if you do. You've got a similar accent, and you talk about the Steelworks in Sheffield.
Yeah.
So what intrigued me about when you use that comment, I spent my early days as an employee of the British Iron and Steel Research Association, and I used to spend quite a bit of my time going down to the Steelworks in Sheffield, which is now Meadowhall Retail Centre, which is rather sad, and travelling a mile alongside a rolling mill where a great big ingot of steel would begin life as the sheet metal 1 mile further down the road, as it were. So it would be intriguing to hear for you to tell me a little bit more about that analogy you were introducing there, so that I could understand in a more practical term what that would mean for a manager in that organization, or indeed somebody working in the factory who was sweltering away trying to understand what the hell he was doing down there. So that's not a curved exercise. It's like it's a meteorite landing on your head, I guess.
I think, I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, but I think that Stafford Beer's work very much focused on management cybernetics, but it did and does elaborate outwards to more general philosophical positions, but quite literally started with the United Steel, or whoever it was in Sheffield in an early phase of his career, studying flow and exactly the kinds of operations that you talk about. And still today, mostly, certainly in my world of business schools, would be understood as somebody with rather idiosyncratic and unusual observations, but which are ultimately practical. And can be applied to the management of firms, where he wrote books on the management of firms, and other organizations. So but along the way, you know, he also did some unusual things, like drawing parallels with the nervous system, for example, drawing directly from nature into the construction, a kind of, I think he would argue it's an isomorphic model, again, correct me if I'm wrong, of how the human nervous system can be translated into firm organization, for example. And I think that was, I would argue, part of a greater journey that he was making into a wide range of different philosophical positions. So on an 80-20 rule, 80% is with you, John, but there is another 20% which is kind of philosophical. I wouldn't be talking this way if it wasn't for Christmas anyway, so it's just because.
So if I can come in, Peter, a couple of observations from me from probably being more deeply steeped in Stafford's work for my doctorate than you were. I think it all kind of joins together. Stafford's big realization, John, in the steel industry was a bit about how you make steel and a bit about how you operate the plant. But it was more about his realization of the capabilities of human beings working in the system, that they were doing things and able to do things that their education and their language and so on would suggest that they weren't capable of. There was a realization of the capability of the human being as much as anything else that sort of came out of that, and his passion for creating circumstances in which those human beings could be their, I think the modern expression is their best selves. But when you then start to translate that into the flow, and this reflects in my sort of intelligent organization stuff, which is very much inspired by Stafford's work, the information flow around the steelworks is partly about, the metal tells you it's hot because it glows red, and as it cools, it stops glowing red, and it's changed shape. So you've made the product through the manufacturing process. So there's an information flow embedded in the flow of materials. There's an information flow embedded in the actions and interactions of the human beings that populate the steel mill, and there's I hesitate to use the expression, but there's a higher order interpretation of that through people that call themselves managers that attempt to seek to control and regulate what's actually going on in the whole thing. And the whole steel business, the whole steel mill, exists in that state of flow that Peter's describing for me. And our challenge as consultants and gurus of various sorts wandering into such places is to actually help the people that are there to understand and interpret and improve what they're doing. And the mechanism that you use, that I use, is the mechanism of information. You have some very structured and deliberate methods for improving quality, and they're sort of focused in that area. But they rely on that information flow around the organization that informs the ability at various levels to kind of make a decision. So the translation for me is through the information system that enables the steel to be improved, the product to be better, effectiveness and efficiency to be pursued in that context. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and of course, highly relevant in the world of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Because the average steelworks now is not in Sheffield, it's elsewhere, and that's because we as a nation did not appreciate the need to develop our technology. So indeed, we would eliminate the human being from that process completely now, wouldn't we? You wouldn't need any human beings in there. One person perhaps in a control room, and the rest will be done by artificial intelligence and machine learning. So I guess cybernetics theory should develop in a big way to cope with the emerging and advanced technology world that we now live in.
Indeed, and so if you, as I mentioned the beer collection, in amongst various myriad books and papers and paintings and all the rest of it, are Stafford's cybernetic machines. The machines he invented for teaching people how to use their machines, for example. So he taught people to use machines by making the machine talk back with the use of little light bulbs. There's a hit this key next. When the red light comes on, hit the key with the red light. So you can actually teach people to use the machine through the machine itself, which was, I've always found fascinating, and I have a desperate desire to become an engineer and rush off and rebuild the damn things, so they could be used using modern thinking. But it's so, and again, we come back to this horrible word of efficiency. And Peter and I, I think it was Peter and I, last time we were chatting sensibly, the distinction between effectiveness and efficiency is hugely important. Because efficiency is a short-term concept, whereas effectiveness is about sustainability and about the viability of the whole entity. So we have to come back to the purpose of the system is what it does. The human actors intervene in the notion of what it does to make it do the things that they want it to do. And effectiveness is defined as the extent to which it meets our expectations of it. Then efficiency has to be defined within that. So doing the wrong thing better is not an improvement in efficiency. It looks like it, and it might make short-term costs in one or more areas slightly better, but it's not a contribution unless it contributes to purpose. So Peter, I wondered whether purpose and flow are, in this conversation, getting close to being synonyms. Another one. Well, I'll let Robin, you think about that. Let Robin ask his question.
So if we go back to the steelworks, and we've got the one man in his control room shed,
and the dog stopping him interfering with it, yeah.
Do we now say that his interactions, the organizational culture, his interactions come from his interactions with the equipment, the artificial intelligence, the machines, rather than other people?
I'll let you into a deep, dark secret because Peter's still thinking. When 1976, I joined Williams and Glyn's Bank. In fact, on the 23rd of August, 1976, I walked into Williams and Glyn's Bank, 51 London Road, Southampton, and was introduced to a thing called a computer. And it was an IBM 3982 golf ball terminal about the size of the headmaster's desk, an enormous great thing with copper windings. So I was basically shoved into a darkened corner of this little branch of the bank in a tiny little branch of the world, and was shown how to process checks and credits and things into this machine. So the first thing I learned about computing was to work slowly. So me and the machine had a culture, and there were two reasons why you worked slowly. One was if you worked fast, people gave you more work. So so you work at the pace of the next nearest person. But more importantly, if you drove this machine fast, as in at the rate that I could actually type in those days, because it had a lot of copper windings in it, they overheated, and when they overheated, it stopped working. And when it stopped working, you had to do the job by hand. And then you had to do it again tomorrow when they'd had an engineer in to fix the machine. So the machine very rapidly taught me to work at no faster a pace than it thought it could cope with. So me and the machine had a good, healthy relationship. I didn't want to work too hard; it wouldn't let me. I mean, it was a sort of perfect culture in that little darkened corner of Southampton. So I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's yes is the answer, and I would just make two very brief observations, one of which is that I discovered Stafford's work when I was working in a software engineering team, and it kind of took off within that team. And John will remember Bob Snowden, and Bob Snowden, quite a philosophical software engineer, was very concerned to see the relations between the users and the software as somehow equivalent, part of the same system. He called it active modeling, because in a sense the cultural output was you and the machine. Now we see that very clearly today, because people talk all the time about young people and their social media culture and so on and so forth. What is that but something similar to your man in the Steelworks operating AI? And Seb Franklin from King's College London has written about this using cybernetics, but where he's talked about digitality as a culture and as a control mechanism in society. So the answer is yes, 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 basically.
We all become slaves to the machine. When I get up in the morning and I wander through to the bathroom, if the water softener downstairs in the kitchen has run out of salt, it bleeps.
Yes.
So it has trained me to feed it with salt on a sort of reasonably reliable basis so that it can remain happy. And we have many machines in our lives, mobile phones, computers, all sorts of kit that train us to feed them and look after them in order to keep them happy. And when we transfer that into societal impacts, how many people are addicted to Twitter or LinkedIn or £5 bets on the GGs or whatever, where the machine is training them to feed it with whatever it is that it thinks it demands. It's a really interesting how we've all become some sort of victim is probably too strong a word, but we are all in a relationship with these machines. And yes, John, I think you're right. The ultra large steel mill now with 3 or 6 people in it and no more than that, and auto dispensing into lorries of loads and all that sort of, what it should have done is freed us up to do interesting stuff like this, isn't it? Rather than making individuals uber rich, we should have kind of gone, okay, we can now have interesting conversations about the meaning of life.
Well, yeah, that's a highly philosophical point. I think if we go back to earlier on, we were talking about if you're in a shed on your own, can there be a culture? I would say if you're in a shed on your own, and you might be in a control room on your own, all you can't have a culture. You've got your values, and those values become in an organization the amalgamation of everybody's values and that lead to behavior, develop the culture of the organization. So even if you work in a control room for Mercedes-Benz in China making Mercedes cars or parts of cars, you're part of the Mercedes-Benz computerized factory culture, that, you know, and you brought your values into that situation. When you're in a control room on your own, there's not much of this culture is impacting on you because there isn't any in there except you. So, for example, if you're asked to work unreasonable hours in that shed of a control room, you're unhappy because you're not paid enough, you don't get enough breaks during the day or blah, 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 you will ride against the culture that's been created for that business.
Is that so? Is it not
that's one thing. And then, but the other thing is, we do need to think. It's not just about phones making us behave in a certain way. I mentioned when we were having lunch the other day, there's a tremendous video. Well, you can look at it on YouTube. Just type in robot dogs in hydroelectric plants in Austria, and you'll see a nice 5-minute video about these robot dogs that service these plants, which have been built to be run by humans, by the way. So they've got steps in them. That's why they've had to create dogs to go up and down the steps to the different levels in the plant. And these dogs run the plant. They go up, plug themselves into the system, take data out, make decisions, learn, and run the whole plant. The humans just go around to see if everything's all right. And by the way, the dog has built into it a process that can detect a body when it comes across a human who's died on the job, which is amazing to me. So, you know, put that into your cybernetics bag and
I think so. Margaret's just come in with a really interesting comment in the chat. So thanks, Margaret. Nice to see you again. And again, it talks back to where Peter was. Our brains, our minds, our imaginations create and inhabit a space. So in which there is a culture in our heads, if you like, and it's about us. It's about where our heads go when we're waiting for the robot dog to come along and find out that we're dead, or when we're waiting for the machine to beep at us again. I was talking to somebody early this afternoon about telling their story. So they're preparing a piece of work to go to an executive committee for a decision, and the individual concerned is a very technocratic lady. She's an accountant by background and training. So what she has written is entirely rational and sensible, and you can do no more than nod your head and agree with it until you put it in front of human beings who bring to it their opinions and their political views and their protectionism of their own little bit of the environment and all that sort of good stuff that goes on in big organizations. So I was saying to her, Steph, you've got to sort of, you haven't got to pitch it, but you have got to write it in a way that will get it accepted within. And actually, you do need to inhabit your world of infinite cultures, almost. I think, Margaret, when you're into that space of what's the world that I need to create and write about in order to persuade these characters to do the things that I'd like them to do. And of course, it's interesting if you look at the work of particularly fiction writers. They create the characters to inhabit the world that they've decided to create. We as organizational change practitioners in various forms, shapes and sizes most of our lives, we have to deal with the world as we experience it rather than the world as we'd like it to be, which poses a whole bunch of different challenges into the process of selling. So I'm looking here now. Mark, hi, nice to see you. I don't know how much of this you're managing to keep up with or know about or want to correct us on, or any comments or thoughts?
No, I joined late, unfortunately, so I want to know if there's a recording of the meeting, so I'd like to watch from the beginning.
Yes, there is. Yeah, it'll be available as soon as I can process it. Same for Mr. Kendrick. Yeah, we process them, chop the boring bits off the ends and the beginning and the end. But we'll get the whole of Peter's session. You'll get all the questions and thoughts that are coming through in here. So Matthew, you're being brave and asking questions or making comments again. So why don't you say them out loud?
Hello. Yes, I think everyone keeps saying the words culture and society. Can everyone hear me, by the way?
Yeah.
So I would argue culture or society is just another word for saying a group of systems interacting with each other, which can be found everywhere. And yes, so if everyone's saying in the shed when you're on your own in the shed, is there a culture? I'd say that because the body yourself is made up of all these parts interacting with each other, they form this culture of society. And then each one of those parts, let's say they're organs, those parts are a society made up of all the cells interacting with each other. So it's like this recursive structure of societies. What I think is interesting is that us as the highest level of the parts, the human, we struggle to see what the lower level societies are actually doing. Like we seem to be negligent of them, and we just think of ourselves as the one whole part. So yeah, that's just something interesting I was
So building then on what you've said about the culture, of course, if you talk to the psychologists they will say, well, yes, so human beings have a system 1 and a system 2, and so we as human beings, the notion of sentience relies on us being able to see ourselves. So when I'm on my own in a shed, I am on my own with me. And so, there's somebody who has worked for himself for 30 odd years, and it's not quite a shed. My office at home is very nice. It's not a shed, but I spend 60–70% of my working life in there in the absence of other human beings. And actually to be, let's call it purposeful, to fulfill my purposes, I have to hold myself to account for doing the things that I said I will do and not doing the things that I've said I won't do. So in a sense, I do have a culture in there on my own, which is inevitably and inextricably connected with a whole bunch of you for starters. But I have to hold myself to account for my position in that flow. And that's really, really interesting to be, because the whole notion of self-awareness fits into then this structure, if you like, that we're creating. And I could sit in my office and do nothing. I could sit and watch skateboarding cats all day. And it has been known, I will confess to the skateboarding cats, and I shall certainly be looking up robot dogs in hydroelectric plants tomorrow, John, because that sounds like a lot of fun. So we're kind of, you're only ever alone with yourself. So the hermit living in the cave is living there for a reason, is pursuing a purpose, which we might think is mad, bonkers, different, whatever, but nonetheless it is theirs, and they're observing themselves doing it. And I think that's really interesting, because I think, Peter, we go right again back to the beginning. To know all these things, we have to have an observer in our philosophy.
Yeah, I think according to Whitehead, he calls it pan-experientialism, which I think accords very much with what Matt has been saying, which is to say that consciousness, so in a sense, experience always happens throughout the entire system. Experience is happening at the level of atoms. Experience is happening within the rock. But consciousness happens under certain conditions where there's a heightened complexity of that, and it's made up of the same stuff. But that consciousness is what you're describing now. Consciousness of self in the shed or in the office, I think, is what you're describing now. And so sometimes people talk about the idea of panpsychism, which is the idea that there's kind of consciousness in all parts of the universe. But Whitehead isn't one of those. He's basically saying there's pan experience. There's something going on in all parts of the universe that under certain conditions creates consciousness. And then we've got John Beckford turning down the third Cats on a Skateboard video in deference to the kind of culture that he wants to represent, and ultimately because you probably want to get the check from the client.
That's totally instrumental of you.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think Matt, you're right. Basically, I think you're right. And on Margaret's question, I think that's similar. That experience is happening everywhere. So that's why he uses the term society. There is an experience of society, even at the level of atoms. You know, the electrons, the society. But a conscious society emerges from that, and a conscious society has an additional something. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. So I was just responding. John Oakland's having to leave us, unfortunately. So we'll see John again next month. So 2 participants have raised their hands. Mr. Randall, I was just going to come and irritate you anyway, because I thought you might be dropping off in a darkened corner there of less.
I thought I'd volunteer up before that happened.
Yeah, good.
So I'm just kind of thinking about the kind of levels of abstraction, because at one level you could kind of decompose everything to almost an atomic model of everything. And thinking about the causality bit and how that relates to that, the chef arriving in the dining room causes dinner. There's a kind of thing here of, okay, could we repeat dinner? So there's what level of abstraction do we go to? Because you could say actually there are certain components. You need the chef in the kitchen beforehand. You need the kind of the food, the materials, heat, all that sort of stuff. So described at a very kind of superficial level. But then if you want to be really certain of repeatability, you need to get a lot more deeper into it, into the whole supply chain and all the relationships. But then that takes me to, I guess, the concept of autonomy, and where Beer talks about this in terms of you have to have levels of autonomy and summarization, because otherwise you cannot have every individual in the company talking to everybody else at the detail that they do their job. So I think one thing is almost the level of abstraction, and that then takes me into the relationship at the start of the talk, Peter, between identity and relationships. And if I looked at the dining room again, in terms of answering the question of what happens next, I could have quite an abstract or abstracted view, which say actually I have a vegan, vegetarian, meat eater, and what is being served is beef. So identity at that level, quite a high level of abstraction, can answer the question of what's going to happen next, who's actually going to eat the food or not. So I think there's a kind of, in terms of answering the question of what happens next, identity can be useful, but it is an abstraction. So I might actually get to an answer quicker by going down the identity route than by looking relation at a very kind of relational basis back through quite a history. That's just a kind of 1 or 2 reflections in my head.
Again, very interesting. I think on the first part of it, that's exactly what Whitehead is trying to get us to think about, which is, in a sense, where do we want to draw the boundary? And I think in cybernetics groups like this, you hear that language all the time, but in other parts of the management school, you don't. You know, is far more readily accepted. And I think, where do you want to draw the boundary, and then to what level of description of fundamental problems to Whitehead? And I think basically cybernetics, in particular Beerian cybernetics, gives you a way of answering that, because you apply the viable system model.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
On the issue of identity and prediction, then I think that there's probably nothing inconsistent between your observation and, again, either what Stafford Beer would say or Alfred North Whitehead. I think that identity then, interesting point about abstraction, but identity would have some predictive value, but not absolute.
Yeah.
In any circumstance, and I think that's quite important. So the kind of the philosophical underpinning of both those writers.
Okay.
Mr. Kendrick, Ian, come on in.
Thank you. I missed the talk, so I may be talking. Oh, I'm on. No, I'm on mute. I've missed the talk, so I may be talking out of turn. But I wanted to pick up on what Matt and Peter said, and to some extent what Jonathan said. Does the name Tony Hodgson resonate with everybody here? Yeah. Tony's an interesting guy. He's 86 now. He worked with Stafford Beer as a research assistant with him and with J.G. Bennett and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He's got a long history. He's now writing an awful lot of stuff, sort of, and the expression he uses is he is being informed by his own death. So he has an urgency to write stuff that he needs to get out there. A big chunk of that is about cosmic ecology. And actually the layers of cosmic consciousness. As Matt was in, and Peter were talking about, actually, he's actually, I wouldn't say he's formalized it, but he's put structure to it with the very notion of where intelligence and consciousness sits. It's rather a profound piece of work. He's also done work on something called qual systems, which is systems with different numbers of nodes in them, and what the elements, what the attributes and aspects are of those kinds of systems rather than quantity-based systems. So I just wanted to surface that. If you haven't come across that, you'll find his work at h3uni.org. I'm a co-founder of H3Uni, and Peter is actually a trustee of H3Uni. There's a resource library there, but that's the way, if that's of any interest at all to explore that, I just wanted to surface that for us.
That's really good, really good. I mean, the rules of this group are we talk about stuff we find interesting. So yeah, so it absolutely fits, because the people who are here define what is interesting, Ian. So it's a sort of I always wanted to run an organisation that didn't have any rules, and I realised if I did that, I'd have to invent rules in order I could break them. So because that's kind of where we're at. People, it's 10 to 7, and Peter, you've kept us engaged solidly for an hour and 35 minutes, give or take a little bit, which I think is an extraordinary achievement. I was kind of wishing that I could stop taking notes and just listen, because there's just so much in what you've played with today. Is it the intention it will become a paper or a book or a magnum opus at some point? What's the aim?
Yeah, I think there's writing in here, not papers, but sort of monographic kind of books down this avenue in the next stage of my career, and it really did start for me looking back and remembering well, picking up Whitehead and so on and so forth. And it was a kind of, you saw some of it, but quite an interesting and surprising time when a group of software engineers all got excited about Stafford Beer and stuff like that.
It will happen. It's starting to happen again. It's starting to happen again. Because we are using Stafford's work, for those of you who don't know, in the work that I'm doing with Network Rail, that Matthew and Cornelio are contributing to, which is good stuff, and that'd be a big part of what we're drawing on. Ian, your hands back up.
Just a very quick one. You triggered something with me. I was talking to a close colleague the other day, and he was recollecting when Stafford Beer was having an argument with another prominent figure in cybernetics who was raising the notion of second and third order cybernetics. And apparently Stafford exploded and said, "Don't be ridiculous. It's infinite recursion." Which is exactly what Matt was pointing to.
Yeah.
Great.
You're reading the right books, Matthew. It's obviously moving in the right direction. So, okay, so I'm going to call it quits. I'm going to wish everybody a happy festive season in whatever Christian or non-Christian form they choose to pursue it. I do hope everybody will have a good time and get a break away from the office, at least for some part of the time. We are reconvening on the 10th of January, I think it is, something like that. And we're talking about the church's organisation, which will be quite an interesting one with Keith Alford. So tickets should be available on Eventbrite in about 6 minutes. And I will see if I can find a better way of, it releases them at 1900 or when it thinks it's 1900. I will find a better way of whizzing them to you than I obviously managed this month. An early warning is that Peter and I have started a discussion about the Cybernetics Conversation 2023, again with the intent of being back at Loughborough for a quiet week when they're not using the rooms, and that looks like it's going to be the 15th of May. I'm looking at Peter for confirmation. He's going to nod in a moment. That will once we've secured the rooms, we will let everybody know and perhaps bring a little more structure and form to it than we did this year, but not much more, because I actually thoroughly enjoyed the sort of slightly disordered form in which it emerged. I think it was actually all about flow, Peter. So yeah. a good point to stop. So thank you all very much for being here. I shall see you all again, I hope, in the not too distant future. And we'll put the recording onto the website and YouTube as soon as I've got through the skateboarding dogs. All right. Thanks a lot. Good night.
Bye-bye.